Hello and welcome to Lowy Institute Conversations. My name is Lydia Khalil, Research Fellow and Director of the Transnational Challenges Program at the Lowy Institute. Ever since his election, foreign policy coverage has been absolutely dominated by U.S. President Donald Trump. But there's a lot more going on in the world than Trump 2.0. Many important developments and stories are not getting the attention they deserve. And I thought, who better to discuss the global developments you might have missed than with our very own Dan Flitton, editor of The Interpreter, the Institute's online magazine. Dan, welcome. Good to have you on the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Lydia. I was giving some thought to this, and I've always wanted to have some sort of a better slogan or catch cry for The Interpreter, something like, if you're not listening to The Interpreter, how can you understand the world? So a real pleasure to be here. I'll try and stop the dad jokes, though.
Nope, keep them coming. But the first development I wanted to chat to you about is a big story, and that's the recent arrest of former Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte. He was arrested by the International Criminal Court, this ICC, for crimes against humanity stemming from some extrajudicial killings that occurred under his watch during the Philippines' so-called war on drugs. Now, Dan, you ran a story about this by Andrea Chloe Wong in The Interpreter. Her piece discussed, among other things, the perennial issue of ICC jurisdiction, especially since the Philippines withdrew its membership from the ICC in 2019, but also how this arrest intersects with domestic politics. Can you talk us through, first of all, what happened, what the issues are, and also what's happening in politics, domestic politics in the Philippines that actually made his arrest possible?
It is one of those amazing stories that you'd have to imagine, were it not for all the heady focus on Donald Trump and the technicolored circus that's emerging from Washington, that this would just be dominating attention in our part of the world. You got to think about what's happened here. Is a former leader from a Southeast Asian, an Asian nation, has been arrested and taken to the International Criminal Court. That in itself is amazing, but there are so many different elements to this, as you've just outlined some of them. Is the first thing is the question of justice for the victims. And we ran a series of stories on Interpreter over the period Duterte was in power. Some of our analysts talked about the so-called war on drugs and that the deaths were involved. It seemed to give it credence when the Philippines withdrew in 2019 from the International Criminal Court, so that they could escape any role that the global bodies might play in this. But the International Criminal Court itself has been quite a controversial body, and it's issued arrest warrants in recent times for Vladimir Putin, for Benjamin Netanyahu, both of which probably won't go anywhere. And yet Duterte wouldn't have been able to be pulled up before the court if it wasn't for the changing politics within the Philippines itself. In the Philippines, Duterte's daughter is also the vice president, and she's just been impeached by the president, or by supporters of the president. So there's a real falling out between the two major political dynasties, between the Marcoses and the Dutertes within the Philippines. You can't separate the domestic politics from the international role here that's for the ICC. So it's a challenge in the sense that there's some people that are cheering for this, and we've had articles not just from Chloe, but also we've got one from Richard Haydarian talking about how this is supportive of the rules-based order notions, which the Philippines is leaning heavily on in its contest with China over the South China Sea. But then on the other hand, you have the potential taint on the International Criminal Court that comes from being seen to be a vehicle by which domestic politics is playing out. And this has certainly played out really quickly. And the arrest warrant was first applied for on the 10th of February this year. It went to Interpol on the 11th of March, and Duterte was pretty much arrested straight soon after. And if you've been following these sorts of international criminal trials in the past, that's an incredibly fast timeline.
So a just arrest, justice for the victims versus domestic political power plays. Hard to tell at this point which way it'll play out. But as you said, it's very much depending on which point of view and who you support.
The other thing is it also has an exposure in Southeast Asia for what is the tenuous state of democracy in the region. The Philippines is again ruled by the son of the former president, Duterte's own political dynasty. He was trying to embed that by putting his daughter in place as the vice president, and presumably someone that would look to run for president in the future. If you look in Singapore, there's been a series of family control in Singapore up to the moment. Brunei, Indonesia, there's doubts about Indonesia as well. So in a broader sense, it's a focus on that tenuous state of democracy in the region.
That's right. And President Marcos himself doesn't necessarily come from a particularly pro-democracy lineage either.
No, not at all.
So the second development I wanted to talk to you about, and again, you've ran some pieces in the Interpreter about this, has been, frankly, a historic development around the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. There was a historic announcement by Abdullah Öcalan, who's the leader of the PKK, calling on the organization to dissolve itself after 40 years of fighting the Turkish government for Kurdish self-determination.
Yeah, Will Gourlay has written an analysis of what's happened in Turkey, and Will just made the point, and I mean it's a similar sense to what's happened with Duterte, that it was just hours before the famous Zelensky meeting with Trump in the White House that Öcalan, all the way over in a prison cell in Turkey, made this announcement calling on the PKK to dissolve itself. And that is another one of those extraordinary moments. And Will talks about this in his piece. It's been more than 40 years that the Kurds have been fighting for a homeland, and arguably longer, but the PKK emerged in 1984. And it's been labelled a terrorist organisation, not only in Turkey, but also here in Australia and in the United States. But what's complicated matters is that even all the way back in the first Iraq War in the early 1990s, and then the US invasion in 2003, the Kurds played a somewhat allied role with the coalition Western forces that were fighting. And then later in the conflict across Syria and Iraq during the years of the Islamic State, that the Kurds were, at least to some extent, alongside Western interests, and that was difficult for Turkey to deal with at the time. So this as a change in the political atmosphere in a very difficult region, this is a remarkable shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the Kurdish forces in northern Iraq. I recall fondly many cold but beautiful winters up in the Kurdish mountains, working with the Kurdish forces in a past life, but also again highlighting that tension that they had in terms of the PKK, a partner organization, being labeled a terrorist organization while also working as allied forces. And we're not just seeing that play out in Iraq, but also in Syria. So really complicated. And I wonder if either the pieces that you ran or if you have any thoughts in terms of what this means in Syria.
Well, I think it's an affirmation of the famous dictum from Lord Palmerston that there's no permanent allies, that there's only permanent interests. But complicating matters too, as you mentioned, with Syria and whatever happens with the interim government in Syria, but there's also an outbreak of protests in Turkey itself, which are not related to this issue with the PKK, but also may perhaps be a catalyst for complaints about Erdogan's long rule in Turkey.
Yes, that dictum about no friends, only interests also relates back to an old Kurdish saying that they have no friends but the mountains. So even though this is a historic development in terms of Öcalan's call to drop arms, time will tell how this plays out. But there does seem to be a lot of momentum about this.
We can't do time will tell. If we were publishing on the Interpreter, time will tell is the kind of phrase that we would immediately strike out.
Well, that's why we have you on there, so you can help us also edit on that one. All right. Now, Dan, you've also had some pieces published on India coming off of the back of the Raisina dialogues, which are India's premier geopolitical forum. Now, You've had one piece by Melissa Conway where she labeled India global fence sitters. And we've also have a piece by our very own research director, Hervé Lemieux, who talks about India mastering the art of contradiction in a world adrift. So tell us a bit about those pieces and also how India is positioning itself in really what we're seeing as the emergence of a real period of geopolitical flux.
We have these big international conferences regularly. So Raisina, Shangri-La Dialogue. We had the Munich Security Summit recently. They're often really hard to write about for the interpreter, and I do get pitches on these fairly regularly, these sorts of conferences, and they're hard for people to execute because it can feel really significant in the moment when you're sitting in the audience, but how do you engage a broader readership on what's happening in a fairly bland conference hall, lit up by fluorescent tubes? But in this case, and what we've seen happen with Munich recently, I think people are looking for waypoints in trying to understand the approach that countries are taking in this moment of flux internationally. And Raisina has been a really good example of that. So for those pieces that you've mentioned there, but we can add to this, Chetty Bajpayee from Chatham House also wrote me something on Raisina. We've seen unfold there, from India's perspective, a real vindication of what approach it has taken in the last few years following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You got to remember, India even refused to call it an invasion of Ukraine for a time, and was criticised for, as Melissa Conley Tyler it was, Melissa had written about the fence sitting that India had undertaken. India also profited from oil, buying oil from Russia that was under sanctions from the West. But the themes that have come out across this conference are around Russia and the Ukraine, and now with Donald Trump seeking to mediate or encourage some sort of a ceasefire. I'm being polite there, forcing some sort of a ceasefire onto the Ukraine and Russia. Also themes around China and the place in which China has in the world. And Hervé seized on this notion that if China and the United States do end up trying to make some sort of a G2 style arrangement where they start to work out the world's problems, that India will seek to have some sort of a role in all of that. And while India talks a good global talk, it doesn't yet have the heft, it doesn't yet have the weight of influence to really shape what's happening in the world.
So, Dan, in a former life, you were a journalist. You covered the foreign policy beat. In any of your time as a journalist, were you ever sent war plans, bombing plans by national security officials?
I never. So like, I'm feeling old here, Lydia. I didn't have the advantage of having all of these social media apps and that sort of thing that people can mistakenly connect you with. No, nobody ever never put me in a into a signal group and put bombing plans for Yemen on the. And the other thing too is that, like, and emojis and caps letters and all this. It's the whole sausage factory question, isn't it? You don't really like seeing the way in which policy is supposedly made.
Yes, and here, of course, we're referring to the White House inner circle officials, the defense secretary, the secretary of state, the national security advisor, among others, discussing plans over Signal for military strikes in Yemen. Now, we've had hot mic moments, like you said, mistaken emails that were sent, but this seems to be pretty extraordinary, a real extraordinary breach in operational security. What do you think the fallout of this is going to be? I mean, in a normal world, you would see some resignations, but do you envision some of that happening in the Trump administration?
Can we say time will tell? No, we can't say that. I don't actually anticipate that there will be great fallout or ramifications. I think that already the administration has indicated that they're going to bluster through this. And the Defense Secretary has already started attacking the editor of The Atlantic and the way in which he's presented these reports. So unless there is some great strike of humility that hits the administration, I don't think that we'll see any real ramifications that flow from it. Yes, people will make comparisons to the claims that Hillary Clinton supposedly was sharing her classified emails on an unclassified system, that sort of thing. But I actually can't see that with this administration that we're going to see serious ramifications that come from it.
Well, you mentioned the attacks against the Atlantic's editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, who was looped in on these communications. But, again, hearkening back to your past experience as a journalist, what's your sense of both how Jeffrey Goldberg handled it and what this brings up in terms of coverage of national security matters?
As I first read this, I did find myself marveling at his reticence to publish, in the sense of taking the time to make sure that this was, first of all, not a prank, which we're all alert to at the moment in all sorts of publishing. I think that Goldberg, by the sounds of things, has done as many checks as can be practically achieved in what is an extraordinary moment, and then dropped himself out of that conversation. It must have been very tempting just to stay in it to see what more could unfold, but they've obviously made the decision that having taken it this far, that if they go any further, that they'll be seen as being too complicit in it all. It is in a sense a remarkable piece of journalism, but it's also just happy happenstance, and it's perhaps evidence of the old saying that 90% of life is just turning up.
Well, Dan, we're very happy you turned up for this episode of Lowy Institute Conversations. Thanks for joining me for this Interpreter Roundup, and we hope to do it again soon. You've been listening to Lowy Institute Conversations. This episode was produced by Andrew Griffiths. You can find past episodes from across the Institute's podcast network on lowyinstitute.org, and you can listen to Lowy Institute Conversations wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining us.